Princess Blue, also known as the Manvel Texas Jane Doe. On September 10, 1990, a man traveling along Highway 288 near Manvel, Texas, had pulled over to the side of the road to relieve himself. While there, he accidentally discovered a woman behind a barricade, sitting inside of a tire, her skeleton in pieces within the area. It was actually a great area to conceal a body. It was sparsely populated, with a lot of land. One of the strangest aspects is that there was no clothing or hair anywhere near her disarticulated bones. The lack of hair was perhaps the most perplexing part of it. She was still, however, wearing a number of jewelry items. The most prominent item she was wearing was a 1975 class ring from Robert E. Lee High School. It was clearly not her ring, as she would have graduated no earlier than 1986 or 1987, not long before she passed away. It is believed she died in 1988 or 1989. She also had a beaded bracelet and a unicorn ring and a few other rings. She received the Princess Blue nickname due to the blue stone in the class ring. Because they had no medical examiner at the time, the autopsy was conducted by Harris County. Unfortunately, it didn't reveal a lot. She had one tooth that had been surgically removed, as well as 2 fractured ribs. She also had some sort of defect in her left knee. They tested her bone marrow for drugs and they found no traces. The examiner believed she was Hispanic, possibly between the ages of 15 and 19, and only around 5 feet tall. Her cause of death couldn't be determined, but it's suspected to be homicide based on how she was found. When the case was reopened in 2006, the DNA was more advanced. Testing indicated she was not Hispanic, in fact, she was white. However, someone of African American descent had entered into her bloodline somewhat recently, perhaps a parent or a grandparent. The DNA also disputed the age, saying she could have been as old as 21. A sketch was created and shown to Robert E. Lee High School, but unfortunately nobody recognized her, and even though the news carried the image of the sketch, she wasn't identified. The high school in question is located in Baytown, Texas. There was no real movement on the case, that is, until Danny Davis of Orange, Texas, gave a sample of his DNA to Texas Rangers, in hopes of finding what happened to his sister Julie. Julie went missing at the age of 16, 33 years before. The Rangers actually thought she may have been a different Doe from another area of the state, but that was disproven when the DNA came back showing she was instead Princess Blue. Princess Blue was later identified as Julie Davis. After 3 decades, her family finally knew what happened, and Julie got her name back. It turns out that Danny had never heard of the Princess Blue case. Like so many too, they hoped their loved one was alive and just not contacting them. He was quoted as saying, "I wouldn't have believed it's her if that detective didn't tell me the DNA matched." It turns out that Danny was a year younger than Julie, and Julie left home at age 16. He believes she married at age 18. It's believed that it's her husband who may have had the connection to Robert E. Lee High School. Danny would say later, "The last thing I remember of her was her giving me a hug, telling me she loved me, and she broke down in tears as she walked away. That's the last time I saw her." A couple of years later, someone told him that Julie had gotten married and moved to New Orleans. Julie Doe was identified on June 17, 2020. She went unidentified for 30 years. If she was alive today, she would be 53. She died when she was around 20 or 21 years old. The Lake Stickney John Doe, 1994. Lake Stickney is located in Snohomish County, Washington. In 1994, the man was found shot in the head and dumped in the lake. It was difficult to identify how long he had been in the lake, which always makes it hard to pinpoint who the John Doe was. His remains went unidentified for more than 2 decades. Forensic genealogists in late 2020 managed to identify him as Rodney Peter Johnson, a Seattle resident. It turns out his body was in the lake for up to 7 years, not the 2 they had believed, which drastically changes the identification process in an unexpected way. There are also many questions as to his genetic heritage. Early forensic reconstructions of his face varied widely. One showed him with a very distinct brow line. At one point, state forensic anthropologist Dr. Kathy Taylor looked at the skull and determined it had traits often associated with African American heritage or perhaps Asian heritage. A different forensic anthropologist from Maricopa County in Arizona would later consult, saying that he was a white man aged 25 to 35. Rodney was last seen by his family members in either late 1987 or early 1988. His body was pulled from the lake in 1994. One report says the police concluded that he was shot in 1987. However, his father reported speaking to his son on the phone in the late 80s, so it's possible he died a little bit later than they estimate now. If the police were right, he was 25 when he was murdered. They believe his body was weighed down and it accidentally resurfaced years later. His family had no idea what had happened to him. Rodney had been struggling with the law and with life in general. He was a foster child at one point. His siblings were 4 brothers and a half-sister. He had spent a brief stint in jail in 1987. He didn't have a long rap sheet, however, but he had been arrested for burglary when he was younger. His most recent brush with the law was an active warrant at the time of his death for second-degree assault, which took place in October of 1987. One tip to the police suggested that Johnson went camping with a girlfriend and was never seen again. The timeline of that trip, however, is not clear at all. When his sister reported him missing in 1994, it was actually to the Seattle Salvation Army. This most likely implies that she felt he was homeless, perhaps running from the law. Just a few months later, coincidentally, that was when the 2 men were trying to untangle their fishing line and had accidentally snagged his decomposed body. Unfortunately, nobody put 2 and 2 together, and there was no indication that the Lake Stickney John Doe might be Rodney. Rodney himself came from a large family, complete with quite a few cousins. He had a cousin named Ellie Perry, who was into genealogy, made the decision to upload her DNA to GEDmatch. This ended up being the key in getting Rodney back his name. The authorities contacted her in 2020 and asked her if she knew of any family members who had gone missing. This led her to suggest looking at the Johnsons. Ironically, Rodney was the only cousin in the Johnson family that Ellie didn't personally know. Both Rodney's sister Marianne and his cousin Ellie would eventually hold a press conference to confirm that the John Doe was in fact Rodney Johnson. Now that the police knew who Rodney was, they were trying hard to figure out who took his life. They were looking for anyone who knew him in the late 1980s, and if those people could contact the sheriff's tip line. The number is provided on your screen. If Rodney had lived, he would be 59 today. He went unidentified for 26 years. The Columbus Jane Doe, 1999. This Jane Doe was found unconscious in front of Kaye restaurant on East Broad Street in November 28, 1999, in Columbus, Ohio. She was transported to an area hospital the same day, and it was ruled that she passed away of natural causes. However, she had no identification on her, and her identity remained a mystery for over 2 decades. She was identified through the Ohio State personnel performing demographic searches on missing people in the database. They eventually confirmed her identity through DNA given by her family. She was identified as Karen Kaye Frank, who was 52 when she passed away. She was born in California and had traveled throughout the country, and that was part of why it took so long to match her to her missing person report. She had moved to Ohio only shortly before her death. She was identified in 2020 and went unidentified for 21 years. The other Columbus Jane Doe, 1998. This Jane Doe was found the year prior to our previous one. She was found deceased next to a building in Columbus, Ohio on May 17, 1998. Her cause of death was ruled to be acute cocaine exposure. She had no identification. Her only belongings were a plastic tube, a glass tube, cigarettes, and $5 in cash. She was barefoot and no shoes were found anywhere near her body. She was found by a truck driver who was distributing petroleum at the time. Both Columbus Jane Does were identified after their demographic information was submitted to a national database. Their identities were both confirmed through fingerprints and DNA evidence. And with this, she was identified as Turina Jefferies. Her identity was made possible through DNA technology in 2020. Turina Jefferies was just 32 when she passed away, and she went unidentified for 22 years. The Lake LaBerge John Doe. In May of 2016, a body was found by the eastern shore of Lake LaBerge in Canada. There was a lot of confusion around this case, as originally a man named Jeffrey Scurvy had disappeared in 2015 after entering the Yukon River at Lambert Street. As a result, many had concluded that this was him that had been pulled out of the water. However, dental records prove this was not him quite quickly. The autopsy shows the cause of death of the Lake LaBerge John Doe was natural, but his identity went cold quickly. Othram Labs worked with the authorities in Canada identifying him last month, which at the time I recorded this was July of 2021. The Lake LaBerge John Doe was identified as Nathan Hine. Nathan was a free spirit who was homeless at the time of his death. That is it for today. I tried to choose does that appeared not to have received too much in the way of coverage. I may do some other identified early on if people are interested in this, even though they're a little bit older, provided that they are not widely covered. Please comment below if this is something you might like to see, or if there is anything else you would like to see covered by this channel. A comment is the quickest way to get my attention. Twitter is probably also the second quickest way to get a hold of me. Thanks for watching and listening. If you haven't yet, it would be wonderful if you took a moment to like or perhaps subscribe. Take care of yourselves and each other.